Good evening, everyone that joined us today. We have some from Israel and some Israelis that are in the US. So for you guys, good afternoon. I'm super excited. This is my first webinar on this topic. And my name is Keren Zilberman. And with me today is Mitch Wexler, Senior Counsel at Fragment, and Jeff DeChico. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He's the CEO and co-founder of FlexPath, and John Iknoyan, co-founder of FlexPath. Each of them will introduce themselves in a minute. I will say a few words about myself. So I was born and raised in Israel. I live with my family in Tel Aviv. And my background is in tech, but recently I started real estate investing in the US. And my family and I have been exploring the possibility of relocating to the US. And while we were doing so, I was first introduced to the EB-5 program. And I realized how much conflicting and confusing information is around online about this program. So the goal of today is to provide clear and reliable information so each person can decide for themselves if it's worth exploring further. Okay, so before we dive into the discussion, I'd love each of our panelists to introduce themselves. So Mitch, we'll start with you, and then Jeff and John.
Okay, thanks, Karen. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Happy to be here. So as Karen mentioned, my name is Mitch Wexler. I'm a senior counsel with Fragment, which is a large immigration law firm worldwide. We have about 70 plus offices around the world, over 7,000 employees. I've been practicing U.S. immigration law for 40 years. This is my 41st year, all case types, not only EB-5, but for the last, I'd say 12 or 13 years by choice, all that me and my team does is EB-5. So this is what we do all day, every day. And happy to be here and be a resource and answer any questions about EB-5.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Jeff DeChico here. So I've been in EB-5 for 13 years. Before that, I was on Wall Street for 25 years. But during my time in EB-5, I probably helped 3,000, maybe 3,500 investors come to the US through the program. So that represents close to $2 billion in investment. And many of those investors have, gone full turn, become US citizens, had permanent green cards, and gotten their money back. So I've had a lot of experience in the program. And John and I recently, in January, launched our own company called FlexPath Immigration Partners, and we structure EB-5 projects that allow investors to come to the US. John?
Yeah, thanks. So my name is John Iknoyan. I'm co-founder with Jeff of FlexPath, obviously his partner in the business. As he mentioned, he's the EB-5 guy, right? He's the one who's been doing it for years, working at some of the big firms, and probably has raised more money than anyone in the market. I'm coming at it from a different angle. I was on Wall Street also for 25 years and worked exclusively in credit markets, largely at one firm, but different aspects of credit, whether it's sales, syndication, structuring. Alongside of that, I had an entrepreneurial run with a couple of companies. Most notably in 2011, I started a company called World Insurance Associates, which was a roll-up strategy of insurance brokerage companies, built that over the next 10 years and then sold to private equity in 2020. So I'm bringing the, sort of Wall Street credit entrepreneurial set to the skill set. And the third leg of the stool, who's not on the call that's worth mentioning, we also have a CIO, his name's Greg Forrester. He ran GE Capital Hospitality for a number of years and, underwrote somewhere between 11 and $12 billion. So he's our real estate expert as well. So that sort of rounds out the team, but I'm excited about the call today.
Thank you. Thank you all. I think we have a lot of experience here combined with all of you guys. Okay, so let's begin. We're going to start with the immigration process, questions about immigration, and then we'll move more to the investment side of the EB-5, and then we'll try to leave about 15 minutes at the end for audience questions. So all the participants can feel free to submit in the chat questions you want us to answer. So let's begin. For those of you completely new to the topic of EB-5, Jeff, can you start with explaining what the EB-5 is and how it's different from other immigration options?
Yeah, sure. It's the best place to start. So broad overview, you invest $800,000 into the US, into a private enterprise project, okay? One that creates 10 jobs for American workers. And that leads to a conditional green card, a permanent green card, and then eventually citizenship should you choose to take it. These projects, your money that goes into them, they're private enterprise. So companies like FlexPath, our company, we go out, we look for developers or businesses that are looking for capital. We structure the deal. We then go out and find investors who are looking for immigration, and they invest into these projects. The really brilliant part about EB-5 is that if these projects are successful, the investors get their money back. Now, they won't get a lot of returns. You're not going to make money in EB-5, but our job is to protect your capital. So it's a way to come to the US through investment. A couple of things that differentiate it from other programs in other countries. Canada has a program, Portugal has a program, a lot of different countries have programs. But one of the great things about EB-5 is there's no test in terms of language and other things. You can come to the US, you can live anywhere, you can work anywhere, you can not work, you can retire, you can do nothing. It's entirely up to you. But when you come to the US on that green card, you have the same access to schools, in-state tuition at colleges, job markets, et cetera, that a US citizen has. So highly advantageous, no skills needed, nothing to prove, et cetera, other than the $800,000 you invest must create 10 jobs. We take care of that part for you. And that $800,000 must be lawfully sourced. So that's the basics of the program.
Who would you say the good fit for the EB-5 and who isn't? Also, we have quite a bit of people here today that are currently living in the US on another visa. So is that also a viable option for them?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that, or Mitch, you can chime in, but it is absolutely an option for people who are already in the US, and there's certain advantages to that, which I'll let Mitch talk about. But in general, people who are looking for, one of the things I didn't say is family immigration, right? EB-5, $800,000 US is a lot of money, but that $800,000 is good for the applicant, his spouse, and unmarried children under the age of 21. So a family 4 or 5, it actually becomes quite inexpensive. So family migration, it's good for people who studied in the US and want to continue to work and live in the US. It's great for young kids who want to come to the US, work in technology, et cetera. Younger people, it's great for them as well.
Yeah, you have to take off on what Jeff was saying. So it's very common for those already physically, legally in the United States to do EB-5. Actually, that's the profile of most of our EB-5 clients. They're either studying in the US on an F1 visa, or they're working in the US on an H1, or they're an intra-company transferee on an L1, or they're a non-immigrant investor on an E2. So there's a whole alphabet of options for people to physically get to the US and to use that as a launching pad for EB-5. So that's pretty common. If the applicant/investor is applying for a green card through EB-5 while residing abroad, which is also common, the case can be structured such that the filing gets done in the US, a portion of it gets approved, and then we arrange for the immigrant visa appointment to be scheduled at the US Embassy in Tel Aviv. Once that immigrant visa appointment is scheduled and the visa is issued, that visa is good for 6 months. So they have 6 months within which to kind of pack their bags, get on a plane, land in the US to activate their immigrant visa. And at that point, they're a green card holder, a 2-year conditional green card holder. And 2 years later, we file some more papers to remove the conditions to make it an unconditional green card. And by then, usually they're almost ready to apply for US citizenship if they want to.
Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about the process in a minute,
Yep.
but now you talked about families. So there's also the Child Status Protection Act. What do people need to know about that?
Yeah, there's CSPA. So some families it's probably not going to be too relevant for an Israeli applicant. It's more of an issue for applicants born in countries that are likely to be backlogged soon. Israel's not even close to approaching their annual allotment. So there's 10,000 EB-5 green cards available worldwide per fiscal year. No single country can get more than 7%. So that's 700, not a big number, but Israel doesn't come close to that. India far exceeds that. China far exceeds that. Vietnam exceeds that. But right now, those countries have not exceeded it. But when they go through the process on the first filing, the age of their kids, the children, freezes effectively while the first phase of the application is pending. Once it's approved, if there's a backlog that they just have to wait on, then the kids' age effectively defrosts and they start aging again. So I don't anticipate this to be much of an issue for Israelis, but if you're interested in EB-5 and you have children that are 20, 19, 18, 17, it's worth a conversation with somebody like me just to make sure that it's not going to be a game stopper.
Okay. So many people considering EB-5 are also exploring other visas like E2, L1, H1B. So how would you compare the EB-5 to those, and when does it tend to make more sense to do the EB-5?
Well, they achieve different objectives. So there are a series of non-immigrant visas that you mentioned. So whenever you hear a letter like an EFLO, that's a non-immigrant temporary visa for specific purposes, either to study or to work for an Israeli affiliate company in the US for a certain period of time. That by design does not turn into a green card. And many people don't want a green card. They just need to be working in the US for a certain period of time, and then they go back home. If that person wants to then take the next step and get a green card and reside permanently in the US, they have to start thinking about different options. So when you hear the terms EB, although those are letters, that's denoting a green card process. So EB-5 is the fifth category of employment-based immigration. EB-2 is another, EB-3 is another, and they're all different. EB-2 and EB-3, for example, I won't get too far into the weeds, they require sponsorship by a U.S. company that has to prove there's a shortage of qualified and available U.S. workers. EB-5 sidesteps that entirely. And an EB-5 applicant can just sponsor themselves and their family, as Jeff mentioned. So we have many clients that are in the United States, let's say working on an H-1 visa, pursuing EB-5, and they just continue the entire process in the United States while maintaining their non-immigrant status. So the EB-5 investment is just kind of on the side. It's basically a passive equity investment. They have a busy day job, and then they go through the process and the green card shows up.
Just one quick note to everybody. We've got a bunch of great questions coming in, so we will address them at the end, and I'll make sure we leave plenty of time, but keep them coming. Really, really good questions so far. Thanks.
Okay, my next question is more relevant to Israelis. So many Israelis today aren't necessarily looking to relocate immediately. I think with the situation here that it's unsteady, some people they want to have options for their future. Would you say that EB-5 makes sense as a long-term backup plan rather than just immediate relocation?
You want me to take that, Jeff? On the first cut at it?
Yeah, absolutely. You start with.
Okay, yeah. So EB-5 is not instant. It takes time. So it depends on the goals and objectives of the particular applicant. If they're looking to immigrate in 2 or 3 years or so, EB-5 is a good option. There are certain investment types that dictate how long the process will be. So by design, we can pick a longer path if that suits the applicant, or we can pick a faster path if that suits the applicant. Once they get their green card and they activate it, they get on the plane, they land in the US, they become green card holders. If at that time they're not quite ready to move their center of gravity to the US, that's common and that's okay. There are things we can do to preserve their green card status while departing the US for significant periods of time. There's a thing called a reentry permit that green card holders are eligible to apply for and obtain. That's good for 2 years. So they land in the US, they become a green card holder, they still have obligations, maybe there's aging parents, maybe there's urgent business activity still going on in Israel. They apply for the reentry permit, comes in, could take a year to get, by the way. Once they get the entry permit, they can safely be out of the US for the duration of that permit, which is 2 years. I have some lucky clients that are on their 6th and 7th reentry permit. That's kind of pushing it, like 2 or 3 is kind of reasonable. But sooner or later, they're going to have to commit to start spending most of their time in the US, but not in the very near future, that's for sure.
Yeah,
That's
just to
it.
add to that, I mean, like you were saying, Mitch, it's not necessarily the easiest of backup plans, but there are stories, I'm sure you've seen tons of them, Mitch, where people who've had permanent green cards for 20 years and come to the US every year for 3 weeks and never get stopped. But in general, it's probably not the best strategy. You probably want to work with your attorney to come up with a strategy to show a preponderance of evidence that you want to maintain status in the US, getting driver's license, things like that, residence, other things.
Yeah.
And a lot of these subjective adjudications is administration specific. So right now in the US, we're more conservative than we have been with other administrations. So we're less risky, more risk averse these days.
Okay. You already talked a little bit about the process, but I think we can dive deeper about how the process looks like and also the realistic timelines as they are today. And let's start with talking about how it is for Israelis living in Israel and also how it is different for people that are applying for it from within the US on another visa.
Well, the very beginning is going to be the same. As Jeff mentioned, we have to document the lawful source and the path of the funds to be used. So the first heavy lift when we just take on a new client is sitting down with them and coming up with a source of funds strategy. So we like to quarantine or isolate the easiest 800K US of their net worth that they're willing to use for this investment. And usually documenting the source of the funds is the easy part. Many of these applicants are professionals. They make good income. So the source is not the problem, or it's not the heavy lift. But what they do with that until they become liquid to make the investment is the heavier lift. So these folks aren't just making a lot of money and just piling it up in a savings account. They're too smart for that. So they're investing in different asset classes, stocks, real estate. So everyone's source of fund scenario is a little different. So some are willing to sell some stock. Some have real estate that they're willing to sell. Some prefer to take out a loan against the equity of an asset. So we help kind of design the easiest, simplest source of funds strategy. While we're doing that, we send questionnaires out to get all the forms. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of government forms to fill out. They then have to select a project. They'll be speaking with folks like Jeff and John, select a project. Once we have all or most of the source of funds documentation, we kind of give them the green light to fund the investment. We don't want them prematurely. What if we can't, put all the paperwork together? We don't want them to make the investment. Rarely happens, but once we give them the green light, they then wire the money into the escrow account of the project that they select. I get a certificate from the regional center. They're in possession of the funds. I put a bow on the whole package and then get that filed. So that's the initial process. If they're in the US, part of that initial filing, in addition to the EB-5 piece, which is done on a form called 526E, we can file an application called adjustment of status, which is for the green card status itself. So once the 526E is approved, it then goes to the adjustment of status group. Then once they approve it, they're green card holders. So there's nothing to fly into the US to activate. They actually get the green card status in the US. At the end of that green card status, it's conditional. The only condition is one of duration. It's good for 2 years. So at the end of that 2-year period, the last 90 days, we file the third and final leg of this journey. It's done on a form I-829. They're taking 6 to 12 months. I have some pending 18 months, but generally 6 to 12 months for an 829 approval. Once that's approved and 5 years have lapsed from the AOS, the adjustment of status approval, if they want to, they can apply for US citizenship. They never have to. They can do so anytime thereafter. That's just the earliest time. That's kind of the full life cycle.
Okay. So while the immigration process is pending, what rights do the applicants have? Like, can they live, work in the US? And how is it different for someone applying from in the US?
Yeah, if they're applying in the US, as soon as we file the application with the adjustment of status component to it, they're legal. So they get a work permit and a travel document. That takes about 8 to 10 months right now to get. Some depending on the status, they can work and travel without that. Some have to wait for that to get permission to work and travel. If they're applying from Israel, they don't get those interim benefits. They're going to have to wait for the 526E petition to be approved and then wait for the visa appointment in Tel Aviv. And then they land in the US and then they first become green card holders. So they don't get any interim benefits if they're applying from Israel.
Okay. Okay. For someone that is with an E2, L1, H1B, is there a situation you would not recommend switching to EB-5?
Well, if the objective is to immigrate, is to get a green card, EB-5 should always be on the table for consideration. EB-5 is not for everybody. It might not be the best option. Depending on their job skills, if they have an H-1B, they're by definition a professional. They're working for probably a tech company or so, and that company can sponsor them. Won't cost them anything. It's usually the employers in the US that pay the legal fees. They'll do that job market search. Hopefully it'll come out okay. And they could just get a green card and take maybe 3 years. And they could do it just on the dime of the employer. As opposed to if they're in the US on an E2, for example, it's their own entrepreneurial endeavor. So there's a prohibition on sponsoring yourself for a green card. So they don't trust that type of applicant to do a bona fide labor market search if you're incentivized not to find a qualified US worker, right? So that an E2 person would be a good candidate or a better candidate to seriously consider EB-5. And sometimes they could use that E2 business to be the investment vehicle. Not always, and it's less common, but it's possible. If they already made the requisite investment amount or soon will, and they're either have created 10 jobs or confident they will create 10 jobs, that may be the way to go. So there's two varieties of EB-5. The most popular one, north of 95%, are what we call regional center-based investments. And that's what we're talking about mostly today because that's most common. But there's another variety called direct EB-5, and that's just investing in your own business or business that you have some equity stake in. So sometimes the pieces of that puzzle can be put together, but the vast majority of cases are regional center-based. It's just more turnkey. They don't have to worry about it. The jobs are taken care of by the regional center, and they can focus on their day jobs.
Yeah, I mean, if I could chime in here, because we actually have a question on that. So Mitch was talking about direct versus regional center, and I think, it's probably close to 98% of investments are regional center. That's the one that we do. It's passive, right? You just invest your money. We take care of the job creation and everything. The advice that generally I give, because people say, like one of our questions here is, can I come to the US? Can I do my own project, invest $800,000 and create a business and hire 10 workers and keep track of it and immigrate? The answer is you can absolutely do that. But it's a little more complex than that. And the advice I think Mitch probably gives, and I certainly give, is if you were coming to the US anyway, and you were going to open a business and you were going to spend a few $1,000,000, you're going to hire 20 or 30 workers with plenty of cushion, you should absolutely tie EB-5 to it and do a direct EB-5. If you're trying to buy a franchise at Dunkin' Donuts or something where you may or may not, you have right around 10 employees, it'll be right around $800,000. And you're really doing it in primarily EB-5. Immigration is your target, but you're hoping to make a little money along the way. That fails generally. And so what happens is people wind up making decisions based on immigration that hurt their business. For instance, the business isn't doing great, but I have to keep on employing 10 people, so I'm going to keep on putting more money into it. They make bad business decisions because of immigration, or they make bad immigration decisions because of the business. They stop hiring people and then they don't get the benefits of a green card. So just to kind of talk about that one question, I think if your intention is to come to US and spend, significantly more than $800,000 and hire significantly more than 10 people, I think it's definitely a viable option.
Speaking of the investment amount, Jeff, that type of business is probably not going to be in what we call a targeted employment area, TEA. So the investment amount is going to be more anyway. Right now it's $1,050,000, but that's soon likely to go up to maybe 1.1 or even 1.4.
Yeah, 1.4 potentially. Correct.
Okay, let's talk more about the costs. So one question that keeps coming up is about what is the total cost? So we have the 800K, the investment itself, but there's other costs around that, right? So let's talk about what those costs are. And also the 800K, is that fixed cash requirement? You said something about you can take a loan, structure it somehow, financing. What is for that investment? What are the possibilities?
It's cash. How you get the cash can be creative. It could be a bank loan secured by some assets that you have, but the investment itself has to be a personal cash investment. It can't be from your employer, even if you own the company in Israel. So you have to realize the income, pay any taxes on it, and then make the EB-5 investment. Jeff, you want to first talk about the concept of admin fees? Then I could talk about government filing fees and legal fees.
Sure. Yeah, the regional centers, companies like mine, in addition to the $800,000, there's usually an administrative fee which gets assessed, and that's somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000, depending on the project type. The difference with that money and the $800,000 you invest is you don't get that back. So that is just a one-time fee that comes to a company like ours, regional center fee.
Government filing fees for each step vary and they fluctuate pretty regularly, several $1,000s each step. So, set expectations on maybe 15K or so for government filing fees. Legal fees will depend on the relative complexity of someone's source of funds scenario. Sometimes it's very simple. They're in the US on an H1. They work for NVIDIA. They peel off a few shares of stock that they have. So those are easier ones. Others are on the other side of the spectrum. It's much more time consuming to put together. But total legal fees, I'd say for all three steps, maybe in the 30K range over the several year lifespan of the case.
So real quick, if I could chime in, we've talked a lot about the 800,000 and we never really mentioned 800,000 versus ways that it might potentially cost more than that. So in order to qualify for the 800,000, which is a couple $100,000 less than kind of the normal, is you need to invest in eligible projects. And typically they fall into one of three categories. It either needs to be a rural investment, it needs to be an investment in a high unemployment area, or it needs to be an investment in infrastructure. So part of what Jeff and I do is and the reality is everyone would rather just invest 800,000 versus, over $1 million, which is where the non-qualified project sits right now. So part of our job is we go out and we find and assess projects that qualify, right? So I just wanted to clarify that because we referenced that there's two different costs, but we're focused on the 800,000 because those are the types of projects that generally get done in the market, people invest in.
That's a good point. Okay. So I think we covered mostly the legal side, the immigration side pretty well, right? So now we're going to switch to the investment side because ultimately people aren't just choosing an immigration path here, right? There's a significant financial decision to make here. But before we start evaluating projects, let's talk about the elephant in the room. What happens if the EB-5 project fails or underperforms? I think this is a question for you, Jeff. And what are the implications for both the investment and the immigration side in this case?
Yeah, great. So there's three different scenarios or maybe four different scenarios of failure. So let's start with the first. You make an investment, and just to be clear, you invest with a company like ours, like FlexPath, your money goes right into an escrow account, so we never actually touch it. And then it goes from there to the actual development project. So if it's a real estate project, it goes from escrow, and then as the developer needs the money, he requests it. That request has to be approved by us and by a third-party fund administrator. For us, we use Baker Tilly, really large accounting firm. So it has to match up to the business plans. We're not just like letting the money go. We don't just hand it over to a developer. He's got to show receipts and a request for it that matches the business plan. We release the funds. The funds go into the project. They get spent. Those receipts come back to us. We tabulate how much is spending to be able to create the jobs, right? So that's important. The jobs are created by an economic model and not people counting workers on a site. So where can the failure happen? So the first failure, which is the best failure, is failure to launch, which would be your money goes in the project, your money goes into the escrow account, the developer never breaks ground, we never release the funds to the developer, you apply for EB-5, jobs are never created, and so you might get a conditional green card, right? Come to the US, but then when it comes time to prove you created the jobs, there are none. And so you failed. And technically you would have to leave the US and et cetera, but you wouldn't lose any money, right? So you don't get immigration. That really doesn't happen because when projects don't launch, in general, they'll give the money back, right? And then you'll have to restart the process and you'll lose your legal fees and filing fees, but ultimately you're kind of protected. The more common way projects fail is this. The project launches, you're building a hotel, money goes in, money spent, all the jobs are created. Fantastic. Your immigration is protected. You're going to get a permanent green card. But at the end of the day, in order to get your money back, that project's got to be successful, right? That hotel's got to refinance or it's got to sell to somebody so they can afford to repay you. Well, the hotel is terrible, never attracts any people. The company goes bankrupt. In that case, that's okay immigration-wise. As long as your money was spent and the project was built, even if it's half built, you'll still get immigration, but you may not get your money back, right? So that has happened in EB-5. Real estate projects, again, your money's at risk. It doesn't have to be risky, but those type of failures happen from time to time. That's probably the most common, I would say. And then John, you want to chime in on any other scenarios?
for project failures.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I would talk about, well, just to stick with the immigration theme, is Jeff mentioned like when you put your money in and you create the job and you ultimately get your green card, there's really three things that the manager like FlexPath controls, right? Number one, we need to do projects that qualify and projects that get approved. So that's on us. And you should never, in my opinion, invest in a project that either hasn't been approved or has a very clear site to approval. Secondly, you have to create the jobs like Jeff talked about. And then the third thing is your money needs to be at risk for 2 years. So the question is, what does at risk mean? So like Jeff mentioned, when you invest, the money sits in escrow until the developer calls it, right? So one of the things that's happened to certain projects, this is something you should ask before you invest into a project, is what's the timeline of when your money's going to be deployed, right? Because sometimes if you're building a rather large project, they go, the EB-5 company goes out, raises the money early on. Your money in some cases has sat in escrow for multiple years. And that clock, that sustainment clock doesn't start. So your immigration clock starts, right? You might get to the position where you're actually ready to accept your conditional green card, but your money still hasn't gotten put to work. And ultimately, your money needs to be at work for 2 years. So again, when that money gets put to work is something that I think is very important. And you should definitely ask that question before you invest. Just to give an example, one of the projects we're working on, for example, we require the sponsor to take our money almost immediately. And when I say our money, I mean your money. So the money gets invested, for example, anything that's invested prior to September 30th of this year, they need to take on September 30th. So we start that clock immediately for you. And the other question is it needs to stay at risk, right? So how can you control that? For example, one way structurally we're controlling that, again, in this same investment, is they're restricted from paying the investment back before September 30th, 2029, right? So that's actually 3 years, right? So we give ourselves a year of cushion just in case, right? So when you think about what can go wrong from an immigration standpoint, that's one way you can deal with it structurally within the investment itself, is just making sure the money goes to work immediately and cannot be repaid until that sustainment clock has ticked through 2 years. But that's another immigration element. I would think just in general, I mean, Jeff and I spent a ton of time when we launched this business. He's the EB-5 guy, right? So I was asking all the questions from the investment side, because there's deals that went bad and like, why do deals go bad, right? And we went through all the different deals that went bad and sort of what went wrong. One thing which we just talked about is the immigration side, right? You don't want it to go bad. You want it to be approved. You want to check all the boxes. But we came up with basically 6 different criteria that we look at. One is the immigration certainty, but just to go down the list real quickly, the things that we look at when we look at projects, and I would recommend that you guys ask the same types of questions. But before we'll take anything on, we look for simple projects, right? So we want something that's not too big of an execution risk, right? So when you think about it, if you're building something that's really simple and small and it's going to take 6 or 8 months and it's repeatable and it's something somebody's done before, to us, that's very simple. And there's not a whole lot of execution risk. When you're building a massive, ski resort that's going to have 3 or 4 different phases to it and take 3 to 4 years. I mean, listen, not to say that can't be done, but you need to be a little careful and make sure who's ever doing that project's done it before and they know what they're doing, right? So simplicity. Another thing we talk about is capital structure, discipline. And what we mean by that is EB-5 is usually just part of the investment that needs to be made for the project, right? There's typically, in some cases, a senior lender. There's always an equity investment. And you want to make sure that all the other parts of that investment are either in place or firmly committed to, right? There's examples where, projects were being built and they were supposed to get a grant from the government as part of the funding. And, as Mitch mentioned earlier, sometimes administrations turns over and viewpoints change. And then that grant was pulled and that project never happened, right? Because the grant was pulled. So again, you want to make sure that all of the capital structure is in place. You want to make sure things are permitted and started, that it's not going to be a huge delay with your money sitting in escrow. Your capital gets deployed right away. And then lastly, you just want to make sure that you have a decent path to exit. As Jeff mentioned, a lot of times these projects rely on refinancing. And, if you do a project and going to be refinanced in 5 years, any real estate project, right? There's always risk to that. So you need to understand, is that the only path to repayment? Is there other ways you're potentially going to get your money back? So these are all the types of things it's no different, quite frankly, than any other investment you're going to make, right? EB-5 is an investment with immigration attached to it, right? So any way you analyze any investment, you're going to analyze these the same way.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that are most difficult with the EB-5 because it's not just put your money like you buy a green card. You have to actually understand this investment. And a lot of people don't know how to evaluate an investment. I think that's what I realized once I started looking into this EB-5. We talked a lot about the job creation, that term. It was new to me. I didn't even understand this at the beginning. So I'd like to understand more. How would you evaluate whether a project has sufficient margin of the, because this is a core requirement, right? If you don't create the jobs, that's one of the failures you talked about.
Sure. I'm happy to chime in here. So the advantage of the regional center program, what we do here compared to, we talked about direct EB-5, where you hire the workers, you're looking at W-2s, and you're making sure they're American workers and they're legal immigrants as well. Here, it's all done by an economic model. These economic models have been approved by the government in the past, and they're used for other programs besides EB-5. So the first thing we do when we start to look at a project is we take a look at the budget and we get all the inputs from the budget, and we have a third-party economist who comes in. They take one of these models, they put all the inputs in, the location of the project, and this takes into account really great things, multiplier effects, like, if you're going to be spending, they consider things like if you're building a hotel, well, your workers have to eat someplace, so they're going to help out the economy locally, right, by eating places. So these multiplier effects, so we're able to get a bunch of jobs out of it. We underwrite, we need at least a 25% job cushion, right? So when we start, and by the way, that's how we size the loan. So let's say there's $100 million hotel that's being built. We would love to be able to to do all 100 million for EB-5, right? The more investors, the better we do. But the restricting factor is always how many jobs it creates, right? So we underwrite kind of backwards, that we size the loan backwards. So we look at it, we say, okay, we give it to our economist. It's a $100 million hotel bill. The economist comes out and says, all right, well, I think this project is going to create, let's say, 1,000 jobs, okay? So if it's 1,000 jobs, technically we could take 100 investors, 10 jobs per investor. Well, we need a cushion. So we like 25 to 30%. So then we would scale it back that way. So we might be able to take 70 investors, and then we'd be able to raise $56 million. So that's how we go about it. And again, the key thing is these job studies that they do, the economist does, they're already accepted by the government, right? So it's very common. These methodologies are common. So we'll get that initial approval for you to get a conditional green card just based on that economic study. The real art and risk comes in, is the money spent the way it was supposed to be spent, right? And that's what happens when we underwrite these projects. We want to make sure the developer is going to spend the money properly. We monitor that the whole time, et cetera. So it's really a formula for a job creation. And the good news for investors too, by the way, is you'll have a general idea where you are in the queue in terms of getting your job allocations. And we update investors every quarter, and we update them on job creation. So you'll know, okay, well, this much money, these many jobs have been created. I might be 10th or 12th in the queue. So once I hit 120 jobs, I can probably relax and say, okay, now I know my jobs are created.
Yeah, one thing I'd add to that too is when we go through this application process right at the beginning of the project, and our economist puts together, this big economic analysis, that's part of the application process. That's shared with investors. So, for those that desire to do so, it's pretty detailed. They can go in and see exactly how we're anticipating those jobs to be created and how that calculation works. So it's not a black box. It's something that is shared with the investors.
Good. That's interesting. Okay, I'll ask the last question before we move to the questions we already got from participants. So there's a lot of skepticism, especially in Israel. Israelis are always skeptic about everything. So some people worry about scams. Some people think investment is too risky. I want to hear from you guys what you think the concerns that are legitimate and which are misconceptions. And also, as an investor, how do you look for those red flags when you're evaluating a project? And last thing about the immigration approval, does it depend on the project being successful?
I'll start with the fraud stuff. Those are good questions. I'll start with the fraud stuff, and then I'll defer to John and Mitch on some of the other things. But to give you an idea of the size and scale of this program, because it's always, I went to India, one of the first people to go to India. Mitch was pretty much one of the first people to go to India as well. And we spent a year or two just telling people back in 2014 that this wasn't a fraudulent program. And now we have 2,000 Indian investors a year, right? There can be fraud, although it's extremely rare now. And Mitch can talk about some of the things that were put in place to prevent it, which are pretty amazing when the program got reauthorized in 2022. But to give you an idea, I'm just one person, right? I've raised about $1.8 billion. Of those projects I've done, already repaid over $1 billion to investors, and the rest are in the works. None of them have failed, but I'm just saying the size and scale of this program is pretty impressive. And I'm one person who happened to have run, one of the larger companies in the business, but that type of success is out there. Sure, projects can fail, but there are tons of, not tons, there are many good regional centers who will do a good job and get your money back. So that's just wanted to give you the size and scope of the success of this program.
Yeah, early on in the program, and EB-5 was invented, it came out in 1990. So we have a long track record. There's a lot of history. And early on, it was kind of like the Wild West, and there were a lot of bad actors in it. But what Jeff was referring to in 2022, March of 2022, the Immigration Service or Congress came out with a modification of the program called the RIA, the Reform and Integrity Act, that really tightened up the whole program. It learned its lessons, and it made it much more difficult in a good way for regional centers to be established and to be maintained. It's a lot more expensive for them to get into the game. There's a lot more compliance, there's site visits. So a lot of things that went wrong pre-RIA have been eliminated post-RIA. So we haven't heard of those disasters in the last few years or so. It's just the whole ecosystem, and I've seen before and after is completely different now. I mean, projects can still fail, as was indicated, so you have to make a smart business decision. But as John and Jeff mentioned, as long as the jobs have been created, and if the project blows up, there's a nuclear disaster, there's a hurricane, as long as the jobs have been created, you get the green card. Again, you might not get all or any of your money back. But even those stories, fewer and further between than they used to be. So in the vast majority of cases, certainly our clients, they get all their money back and their green card and some nominal ROI. As John mentioned, none of these are good financial investments. So you want to get your money back as soon as possible. You can do much better with your money than a regional center can.
Yeah, of course. Okay.
Yeah, so just to add to that real quick, because I'm looking at the questions too and one of the questions was about transparency of the process and how you analyze the financial project. So it sort of ties into what we're talking about here. And that's, I guess I would lean on that. I mean, you need to do your diligence on the projects, right? Because we love talking about our projects. We're proud of them and we share so much information, but ultimately you're going to see very different projects and they all accomplish the same immigration goal, really. So it's really about your 800,000 and, how it's going to be protected and where that investment sits in the capital structure and how certain it is you're going to get it back and what protects you, just like any other investment. But it needs to be transparent. And clearly, if it's not transparent, there's probably a reason for that. So you might want to look at a different project. So, again, transparency is key. And I think you're going to find from most that there's going to be a lot of transparency. It's just exactly how the investment works. But you need to be careful. I will say that because, there's examples, again, coming from the Wall Street side. When I hear about deals where people, are investing in certain parts of the capital structure, you're like you're a mezzanine lender and there's a senior lender, right? And they're raising money and you don't even have that intercapital arrangement formulated between the senior and the mezz and how that works. Like stuff like that, it just drives me crazy. So you do need to do your own underwriting and make sure that you're, investing in a project that makes sense.
That's important. Yeah. Okay, so let's move to some questions we received from the audience. Someone asked just before someone that couldn't join today sent me this. So I want to start with this. The EB-5, he's asking, is the EB-5 the simplest path from E2 visa to green card?
Nothing simple. It's a popular route from E2 to green card. So there are different varieties of E2. There are investors and directors can get the E2 or essential employees. So an essential employee might not also have an equity interest in that U.S. entity, which means that U.S. entity can sponsor that essential employee and go through the process I alluded to a little earlier, doing the labor market test. That's probably the most cost-effective, fastest way. Not that common. So it's probably most common for an E2 investor to get a green card, since their own company cannot sponsor them, as I mentioned earlier, is to go through EB-5. Some of these investors are unmarried. They're spending, years in the U.S. Love is in the air. They end up becoming the spouse of a U.S. citizen. They can go that way. Some of them have adult children who are becoming citizens one way or another. So once you have a child that's 21, who's a U.S. citizen, mom and dad can get a green card off of them. So each case, we kind of analyze and come up with the fastest, cheapest way to achieve the objective.
Mitch, have you worked with Israeli families before on the EB-5?
Yeah. I see the name of one of them actually in the group. But yeah, it's not that popular. So which is why we're having this webinar today. I mean, as Jeff alluded to, most of our clients are Indian, Chinese, Vietnamese, Canadian, and a smattering from all over the world. But it just hasn't resonated for one reason or another. And I don't quite understand why for Israel, because it's a great market for it. It's a great need. And I think it could really, fill a need for Israelis looking to kind of move their center of gravity over to the U.S.
Do you have a sense of roughly how many Israelis pursue the EB-5 a year?
I don't.
I mean, the data I've seen, it's gone up to about 10 to 15 a year, but that trajectory just, not that this is going to happen with Israel, although that was the number for a country like India back in 2014. And now that number is 1 or 2,000. Of course, that's not going to happen. But the same thing happened in Vietnam and other countries. What we found is it's about regional centers like our company putting the effort in to reaching out to those countries. And once the awareness hits, then people realize, wow, this is a good path. And then it just depends on demand. You can't convince anybody to come to the US, nor do we ever do that. But you can let them know that if you're thinking about it, this is a good option. And I'll tell you, in terms of awareness in the US, my wife's favorite thing to do is when we meet new people and they ask me what I do for a living, she likes to sit back and smile, because no one in the US knows what EB-5 is or has heard of it, right? It's such a small program. And the same thing, when we go to these new countries, people are like, wait, you mean you can just invest and get a green card in the US? Like, no one knows when we go to new countries. So it's about spreading that awareness, which is, why I'm glad you're doing this.
It's probably worth spending 30 seconds on comparing it to the gold card, because that's completely different. I mean, it's a path to get a green card, but right now it's $1 million donation, not an investment to the U.S. Treasury. And you still have to go through a process. They don't just hand you the green card. So consultations that I take about gold cards in about 10 minutes, we're just running with EB-5. It's an $800,000 investment that you'll probably get back to get that same green card.
Mm-hmm. Someone's asking, if there's a 10 to 13% admin fee, why is there no ROI on the 800K?
I mean, I'm happy to take that. John, you can chime in after if you want. Look, in general, EB-5, developers look to EB-5 as to enhance their returns, right? So if you take a traditional real estate project, if they go out and get financing on the market, they might pay 10 or 11 or 12% for that financing. In order for us to entice them to take EB-5 money, generally, we have to cut that in half or so. So, it goes down to 5-6%. We make money as a regional center by underwriting these projects, which can cost 7 figures to do. To underwrite these, to go through the process, take us 6 months, filing fees, et cetera, job studies, all these things. So we make the spread between what you get and what the developer pays. Generally, you'll get 1% or less, right? It will keep that spread. So the reason why you're not getting much of a return is, if we were to do this as a business and go to a developer and try to get you a higher return, 5 or 6%, we'd have to charge the developer 10 or 11 or 12%. He's not going to take our money, because why? You can just go to a bank and get it. So it's just the nature of the business to get a strong developer. And by the way, these are institutional quality projects. These are world-class developers. Like United Overseas Bank, UOB, is the sponsor of one of our projects that we have. You're talking about like world-class sponsors. They can get capital from anywhere. We entice them by making it cheaper. So when that happens, unfortunately, Your concern is the green card. So we structure as safe as possible, get your money back and get the green card, but there's not a lot left for returns for you.
So that's actually the cost of the EB-5 program is missing out on that float for 5 years, what you could otherwise have earned.
That's right. That's exactly right. So we always tell people the real cost of this is probably $300,000 to $400,000, right? Between the administrative fee, filing fees, and then the cost of that money not being in the market.
Okay. Someone's asking, is it limited in time? In case I receive this visa, can my children go to college? She also is asking about healthcare through the investment, but I don't think that's relevant to this program.
Well, once, as Jeff mentioned, this is a family package. So there's one investment, spouse, kids under 21. So they all get green cards and they can go to school, work, not go to school, not work. So all the benefits of a green card for all family members. I don't know if that quite answers the question.
Yeah, well, one huge benefit is if you come to the US and you have kids that are going to go to college, and you get a green card, if your kids live in California where, probably 10 of the top 25 schools in the country are state schools, your kids get in-state tuition. And we've seen this, right, Mitch? We've seen tons of our investors from China and India settle in California because UCLA, UC Berkeley, all these great schools, and tuition gets cut in half or more. And so each kid that goes to one of those state schools and they get that benefit might save $100,000 to $150,000 over the course of the 4 years by living there. So some people can justify it financially by saying, oh, I have 3 kids, I'm going to send them to California schools, and EB-5 pays for itself.
Okay, good. So I'll take the last question. There's a few more, but I think we're running out of time. So what is the projected timeline and exit strategy for the return of initial investment capital once the immigration process is completed?
John, you want to take that, or?
Yeah, sure. So remember the immigration process and the investment, other than the 2-year sustainment period, they sort of operate on their own timelines, right? So the immigration process happens and then the investment is something separate. So it does vary. I think most investments tend to be structured to be no longer than 5 years. And a lot of times they're, 3 years and then +1 where the developer has options to extend them for a year at a time, up to 5 years. So that's generally how you should think about it. But again, it's investment by investment. They're always going to be outstanding for at least, 2 to 3 years because they have to be in order to qualify from the immigration standpoint. So, and like I said, most are structured for 5. I think the one variation in there, I go back to how quickly your money gets put to work, right? Because if your money doesn't get put to work for 2 years and then it's a 5-year investment, it ends up being out of your pocket for 7 years. Right. So again, I think that's something everyone should focus on.
And one thing I wanted to address, because it was in one of the questions before, and I don't think maybe we didn't get the point across. So you don't give your money to John and I, FlexPath, and then we decide where to put it. We give you we show you a project. You get 300 pages of documentation on it, etc. All the due diligence you want. You ask us a million questions. You go through this process with us, and your money goes into that project and only that project. So we're not fund, administrators. We don't get to choose where your money goes. You know what you're investing in. We're just the sponsor. So just to be clear. So in terms of due diligence, trust me, like when you get into this, average 50 to 100 questions, right? And multiple meetings where we go through granular detail about the deal.
Great. Okay. So before we wrap up, I want to thank you all, Mitch and Jeff and John, for sharing your time and expertise. My hope is that everyone that was here today, at least they maybe now know if this is worth pursuing or know that it's not worth pursuing for them. So I think we got a lot of information across, and I'm sure we didn't answer all the questions. So everyone can feel free to contact me and I'll connect you with the professionals, because I'm not the professional here. I'm just the one asking the questions. So yeah, thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.